let's just crack straight on with the show proper. And it's a huge delight to welcome back for the third show in a row, the TheHogTieChamp, and also, as I've described him before, one of the backbones of the show, Concordance, who's been with us pretty much from the get-go. Got various topics lined up. We're going to kick off straight away with one of them. I'll keep you up to date with the others as the show progresses. But we're going to kick off with Concordance.
So, hi. I wanted to talk about something that started back in January, but it's in the news now, about the passive distribution of Bibles in 11 public schools in Orange County, Florida. So back in January, a group called World Changers of Florida, a biblically based religious advocacy group, began distributing passively Bibles just laid out on a table. The Freedom from Religion Foundation, the FFRF, protested, or rather complained, and the school refused to stop the practice, and the local courts upheld the decision. So the Freedom from Religion Foundation, as a sort of protest move, demanded or insisted that they be allowed to also put out passively material that promoted different viewpoints, right? Because it is a public school in Orange County, Florida. So they proposed the following books, things like Why Women Need Freedom from Religion, an X-rated book, Sex and Obscenity in the Bible. What does the Bible say about abortion? 10 common myths about atheists. What is an atheist? And many of these things were prohibited for violating the school's basic whatever morality principle on content. So, for example, they blocked Sam Harris's book because it described the sacrifice of virgins, killing and eating of children in order to ensure the future fertility of mothers, feeding infants to sharks, and the burning of widows so they can follow their husbands into the next world, which of course were all documented religious practices. So now we've got the situation where these things are being promoted within the school, and it's going to end up going to the courts. And I just wanted to hear some discussion about whether or not you think passive distribution of religious materials is constitutional, something we should fight against. There's a lot of backlash against atheist or FFRF lawsuits of the school as being whiny or petty. Since the school is obviously not endorsing the material, it's just being made available in the same way that a Bible might be available in the library.
I actually don't really have an issue with it. I mean, I think it's a bit of a strange maneuver on the part of religious folks to say we're going to leave some Bibles laying around. I think it raises the question about what kind of things we're trying to not have happen in schools. I mean, to me, it seems quite far apart from what the good news clubs are doing, where they get very young kids and they proselytize to them not simply a biblical message, but the sort of a message of hatred and contempt for other people. And you kind of think, well, that's the sort of religion that you don't really want to have in schools. I mean, the Bible, how do we look at it in a secular society? It's a book, right? And if somebody wants to leave a bunch of books laying around, I myself don't really have an issue with it.
I mean, Concordance, what's your view? Apart from the fact that there may be a breach of the Constitution, I don't want to underplay that. I mean, do you think it's a serious issue? Because it's not the most effective way of teaching children about the message of God, is it?
I think it's one of these wedge strategies. I really do. I think they're always looking for some way to insert religious messages into the school. And it really is a matter of fighting a fight to keep a fence up. And I think it's important that groups like the FFRF, it's very clearly an tacit endorsement of what content is available. I'm sorry, what content is acceptable to the school seems to have been very specific to the religious background. I understand the needs or the desires of the religious school board to allow these kinds of things, and politically I understand the maneuver that's going on. But in all honesty, someone will be made to feel uncomfortable as a result. And it's the beginning of breaking down that very important wall that divides the two halves of our society, the secular side and the non-secular side, and the Lemon test. If you know what the Lemon test is, DPR, you familiar with it?
No, do go on. Explain.
It's a result of a court. I have to remember exactly how far back that court decision goes. Lemon versus Kurtzman, I'm sorry, no, that's a 1968 policy. 1971. Basically, it said that legislation or policy has to meet three basic criteria. It must have a secular legislative purpose. This is clearly religious in nature. It must not have the primary effect of either advancing or inhibiting religion. This clearly promotes religion. And it must not result in excessive government entanglement with religion. I want you to think about this. What if a Satanist or a paganist or a Hindu radical whatever showed up at that school and wanted to passively distribute literature, right?
Actually,
Go ahead.
Yeah, can I ask a question? Okay, who's distributing the Bibles? Is it the school administration or any public employee that's distributing the Bibles, or rather is this an occasion like the school is sort of open for people to leave books out on tables? Is it, and then members of the public are coming and doing it?
Yeah, I think the latter. So this group is, of course, spending a lot of money to put Bibles on tables,
Right.
And I think the school just doesn't prevent it.
Yeah. Well, your reference to the Lemon test, I think ultimately puts restrictions on governmental activity, and that is government including all public employees, including teachers and whatnot. So, I mean, I agree with your point that putting these Bibles out is clearly, not for any secular purpose. It's clearly for religious advancement. But I don't think that the separation of church and state, or as voiced in the Lemon test, is there to restrict private individuals from putting that message out. I would agree with you if it was the school that said, well, we're going to give these Bibles to students, but keep out the Quran. That would be a huge problem. But I think maybe that's where I see not.
Well, that's exactly what they're doing, and that's a good point. That's what the FFRF were testing by putting out directly anti-Christian literature. They were forbidden from putting some of it out because it didn't meet whatever criteria, references to bad practices, immoral or, illegal or illicit or whatever kind of content that violated the community standards. But the Bible itself contains those references. It contains, pornographic descriptions of intercourse, or, it contains a lot of atrocity. It contains things that the community tolerates because it is part of this religious text. It entangles the school in deciding what religious content is acceptable and is not acceptable to be left out on tables on the campus. So while I understand that this is a very mild test, it is a test to see whether or not we will allow the schools to become passive participants in the proselytization of school children. The best thing for people to do is to wait off the school grounds, to keep all of this exclusively private and not entangle it with public schools. People are welcome to go to church every Sunday and pick up a friggin' Bible. I guarantee you that there is no corner anywhere, at least in Texas, that is not within a mile or two of a church where they have a Bible, which they will willingly give you. Every hotel is filled with these Bibles that say, "Take me." It's not as though there's a shortage of Bibles and they're meeting some critical need. The purpose here is to establish a legal precedent whereby passive proselytization or passive evangelism is going to be permitted simply because it is the action of a private individual on public facilities, so that public is paying for these kids to be sent to this building and exposed to this religious message. And it puts the school in the perspective of having to decide what material is and isn't acceptable.
Well, I wonder, maybe I don't understand the situation because I'm thinking of the schools I've been in. I mean, you can't just wander into the school and start putting pamphlets and books and whatnot. Like, what if I had written a book and and wanted to leave 100 copies of my book about volleyball, tell kids, hey, play volleyball, it's fun. Can I go into a school and leave these books around on tables? Is that, maybe I don't understand the situation.
Yes. No, you can. Actually, if there's a public board of some sort and you get the permission of the school, they're in a position to endorse or not endorse, tacitly, to permit or not permit what content they deem appropriate, right? It's when it becomes religious that they now become entangled in the religious content of the message that can be presented. So as long as, this is why I hearken back to the Lemon test, is as long as it is a secular decision, in other words, this material is or is not okay on a secular basis, but is or is not acceptable because it's, say, religiously disturbing, or involves not endorsing or endorsing some view which people find religiously objectionable. Now you've got the government entangled. Do you see the difference?
I think I do now. I mean, I think there's a potential for an ironic situation here, and that is, suppose that this board, whoever decides to grant access to the property, says, okay, you can come in and put your volleyball book, and you can talk to students about volleyball. You can bring in some pamphlets about joining some club or whatever else. And then when people show up with the Bible, they say, no, you can't bring in the Bible. Because now they're making, remember that in the Lemon test, it's not simply that you can't do something to further a religion, but you also can't do anything to impair it. So if they have the doors open for all these other different things, and people can come in, and they're not scholastic issues, right? I mean, it's just whatever people want to bring in. But if they specifically put up a barrier against putting the Bible in the schools, then I would say, and it might seem ironic, but that would actually flunk the Lemon test, because now that public body is making decisions with regard to what religion to advance or what religion to hinder.
Yep. No, I think you're right. And for clarification, because I don't want this to go away from the factual basis of the argument, I believe the initial distribution of the Bibles was part of a small public forum at the school. So the students were called in for a sort of a meeting of some sort, and this whatever Christian organization brought in the Bibles for distribution. So it was kind of like, as I picture in my head, one of these big PTO type meetings, and a religious group showed up to promote their message, like setting up a booth. I think it is a little shocking, if you don't think about it clearly, that it's okay to, say, set up a booth and sell cookies or whatever, a fundraiser, for as long as the group itself has no explicit religious message. And we run into gray areas in certain things, like the Boy Scouts, which is clearly a religious organization to some very minor extent, and across the country. Boy Scouts are subsidized in that they can hold their meetings for free at public schools. These are schools paid for by the taxpayers, which are usable for a religious group. And I think a lot of people would object to that. That's showing favoritism towards one particular group with a particular religious inclusion criteria.
Concordance, perhaps you can jog my memory, because whilst you were talking, the book of Pandas and People and its introduction into the schools of Dover. What was the issue there? Because I know it was done through some form of skullduggery between some of the directors, but what was the issue about the actual content that they had an issue with? Because on the face of it, it was, of course, a book about science.
That's true. And of Pandas and People probably could have gotten through, because it wasn't explicitly religious. It had omitted, and then that's the trick, is the NCSE were able to reconstruct that Of Pandas and People was cut and pasted from material which had already been ruled as religious messaging. And so this is where that C-design proponentists typo. Are you familiar with this? If you've watched lots of NCSE videos or the history of Kitzmiller versus Dover, they found large tracts that had simply been cut and pasted from an older book which had explicit religious messages. God created X, Y, and Z. And then there'd be a short blurb where it would talk about how creation design proponents, right, which is creation design, or C design, was sort of the predecessor to intelligent design creationism. They showed that those tracks of text had been cut and pasted by the authors, and the only thing that had changed was the phrase C design proponent had been replaced with intelligent design proponent. And along the way, they copied an error, and that error was then replicated in the new book. So that was part of the case that was made, was that it was simply a rebranding of creationism, which was explicitly excluded from the classroom.
Well, although I think where the real big problem with it, I mean, they could have actually, remember, the school board would not have been allowed to distribute those books, either in the old form or the new form. The new form was a little more sneaky because they took out references to creationism and creationists and changed it to design proponents and whatnot. But where it really got them in hot water was even the new books were turned down as not being appropriately at the right scholarly level, and they were turned away, and yet they showed up from an anonymous donor. Somebody had donated these. And when the board members were asked, hey, do you know anything about where these books came from? They said, well, no, we don't know where they came from. And one of them was asked this at a deposition under oath, and it turns out that he was behind ordering them. So I think where this really got them in hot water is that, I mean, these board members are public servants, and they have a legal responsibility to be honest with the public when asked questions. And this guy outright lied. It was he and his father had written checks to cover the cost of these things and to place the whole order. And then when asked about where the books came from, they just straight up lied about it. So that was something that really went poorly for was it Dover? Yeah, the defendant in that, because representatives for the school system were caught lying under oath, which is obviously a big deal.
Yeah, I think they even had testimony or video, I can't remember which, of them talking about it at their local church, where they had sort of promoted this idea that we're taking up a collection, or we've received monies to supply the school with God-fearing biology. And that became very, very embarrassing for them in the trial after they denied it.
I think the people's names, if I remember rightly, were Bonsell, and I can't remember the other person, but it was Bonsell's father who had done the pleading at a church and then sent a check to his son. His son couldn't remember where this check came from, and I mean, it's just, or where the money went to, or where these books came from in the first. I don't know. It just staggers me and this is in a much more general way, how the theist seems to have no problem at all with dishonesty, provided dishonesty is to serve his perceived deity.
I think that sums it up quite nicely. They do seem to, and again, not all of them, but I mean, they're certainly many of them that seem to write a license to themselves to be dishonest, to spread untruths about circumstances or spread untruths about people, because somehow they convince themselves that it's good for God's message.
That's the whole Discovery Institute, isn't it? That's their basic mission, is to provide a dishonest front for something that comes behind them, which is this sort of fundamentalist Christian agenda.
I hope we're going to be joined by Yuri in a moment.
Yep, I'm here. I'll just turn on my video to show you one quick thing.
Sure.
This is my Bible handed to me at school. I've never read it, and it's been on my shelf for under 5 years, something like that. So it didn't work for me, but I think what they did in England here was pretty sort of really tame. Literally had some really pacifist organisation come in and give these small Bibles, and you could refuse politely. But my main question, and again it's a big question, is do you think we should even have religious schools, regardless of what religion, what country? Do you think we should have them?
Concordance.
I think that people ought to have that freedom. Yeah. And I think any rule which prohibited that would be so draconian that it would be unacceptable to even the likes of me. I don't want the government saying what religion can be promoted in a private school. What I care about is what in a public forum, in something that everyone's tax dollars go to, there's an inherent unfairness to my voice in the government being drowned out by the religious voice. That bothers me much more. So I think actually, while I don't like them, I don't like the idea of children being indoctrinated, I can't see a way that preserves liberty but somehow reduces the impact of those. Maybe I suppose you could have a minimal requirement to teach certain factual, objective, secular concepts like actual history and actual biology. But beyond that, it would be such a dangerous gray area.
HogTie, what's the position in Canada?
Well, Canada initially, in its settlement a couple hundred years ago, was settled sort of hand in hand between the empire of the day and the Catholic Church. Is actually, as the western part of Canada was settled, there were large pieces of land that were given to the church, and in most provinces, you choose between going to a school that's under the supervision of the Catholic School Board or a public school. And it's only been recently that it sort of occurred to people, maybe we should have some other religious influences other than Catholic. But yeah, the Catholic schools are very popular here, very common. There is, how do I say this now? Because there is a public interest. Let me say first, I'm agreeing with concordance. I do think it would be draconian to try to say, well, no, we don't want to have education. We don't want to have religious-based schools. Education is education, and let religion be something else. It'd be very draconian to do that. But I think we have to recognize there's a legitimate public interest in making sure that children who can't stand up for themselves are getting, proper education, that there's basic information that's there. So the Catholic schools are held to this, all religious schools in Canada, that is, are held to the same standards for end-of-year examinations. So, for example, if you wanted to set up your own school that taught that the world was less than 10,000 years old, you wouldn't get away with it, because part of the science curriculum says that like there's a provincially mandated science curriculum, and you can't make up your own science curriculum and say, oh, well, these kids think that the world is 6,000 years old, and those kids think that it's 4.5 billion years old. That stuff just doesn't fly. But yeah, the religious education is seen as a guaranteed liberty here. And okay, I guess I'm fine with it.
What's your view, Yuri?
I sort of agree with concordance and HogTieChamp to a sort of level. I definitely agree that it's not pragmatic. It's not even possible now, unless religion somehow would phase out with no conflict out of sort of being. You couldn't just not have religious schools. And yes, it would be very draconian and sort of like, I don't know, not fascist, but sort of a V for Vendetta style government which would do that. But I'm really fundamentally opposed to the idea, because unless someone by any miracle in the chat hasn't heard of Richard Dawkins' view on this, it is the equivalent of saying, let's have a Marxist school or let's have a Lib Dem school. It's not. It's sort of putting kids to their parents' opinion. I can't put it eloquently, but enforcing their opinion on the child when they could easily grow up to be something else, another religion, or not have a religion at all. But there's lots of cases, certainly in England, where you'll have a Catholic school. And yes, we have a national curriculum which teaches evolution and so on. But there are lots of examples where they will spend 30 minutes in evolution and say, oh, it's a bunch of so-and-so, don't take it as fact, and let's go on to this creationist rubbish. So, and the only thing I like about Michael Gove right now, the Education Secretary in the UK, is that he's placing more emphasis on evolution in the biology curriculum and making sure it's more thoroughly taught. So yeah, we can't abolish them, but we need to make sure it's thoroughly regulated so kids learn the truth, essentially.
I suppose the question that I would pose to all of you as a result of what you're saying, I mean, concordance, you said you don't like the idea of indoctrination of children. I think Hogtie agreed with you. Yuri's sort of like expressed those sentiments as well. Clearly, I think that it would be a ridiculous idea to try and stop anyone educating their children in whatever way they wanted, as say to whatever religious beliefs they wanted, because it would, for no other reason, it would be unenforceable, and an unenforceable law is not worth the paper it's written on. But you seem to have a bit more freedom when it comes to the idea of faith schools and private schools. Are you saying, Concordance, that there is nothing that ought to be done to regulate faith schools or private schools?
Again, yeah, I think they need to be regulated. I think that everyone has what is sort of a human right to not free education, to learn. I think everyone has a right to have access to education. That being said, you really do want to be very careful letting the state become the final arbiter of the religious content of education. I weep for the children who can no longer think for themselves because they've grown up with fire and brimstone and psychological manipulation and the abuse mentality that prevents you from freely criticizing the institutions you grew up with. Those children are going to be beyond the reach of reason. And Hogtie has a good point. There is a vested public interest in an educated populace. But I think we have to be very careful not to overstep the bounds of government, controlling what people can do privately, for example, in their homes. So long as no one is harmed, it's very hard to tell parents, you cannot teach your child that. You cannot send your child to a tutor who says this. I think the best thing you can do is establish positive criteria, like I think Canada's model, where you have educational standards that children and schools both have to meet in order to achieve, the diploma and to maintain their accreditation. But in the U.S., homeschooling is a great way around that. The kids are homeschooled in order to avoid exposing them to horrible materialism or anything non-religious. And I think that's a terrible thing. These kids never had a chance. They're so sheltered from the larger secular world that they grow up with these horribly distorted viewpoints. That's certainly not all homeschooling, but there's a very small subset. There's quite a few of them here in Texas where that's why they're homeschooled, is to keep them away from any controversial ideas to their religious views.
I'll give you a case. I'm not going to mention any names because people at my school might watch this and that will cause a lot of trouble. There are some people at my school, even if they're getting decent grades in biology, who still dismiss evolution as a piece of shit. That is the exact word. And I find that unbelievable and slightly offensive coming from the country where the idea was formulated. And I'm not sure of the specifics, but I'm sure evolution and the knowledge of how viruses and bacteria evolve has certainly saved quite a few lives, if not thousands. I find it amazing how people can dismiss the idea because they come from a creationist family and just after the exam's done, okay, it's rubbish.
So are you saying that these people that you talk to will willingly write what is necessary on an exam paper to get the grade, but deep down they don't believe any of it?
Yep, that's exactly it. So I think there must, I'm not sure how, but there must be something to try and stop this. I'm not saying enforce and say, like, to hell with all the creationists and so on, but I'm saying you have to make it vigorous and important enough for people to actually take it seriously and not just put it in the exam.
I think improvements in education can get us there in the public schools. And I think that it's the job of science proponents, how would you say this? Promoters of science, popular promotion of science.
Your Brian Coxes and so on.
Yeah. and I think that it's not just evolution, right? There's a lot of denialism out there. There's a lot of squishy thinking and a lack of reason and logic. I don't know that there's been a lot of times in history when the majority of people were living their lives in a reason-based lifestyle. So it's the battle of the last 600 years. Can we get to a position where societies value reason and logic and smart scientific thinking? I don't think we're there yet, and I don't know that the educational standard is the only thing holding us back. I think it's more of an outgrowth or a symptom of an underlying problem.
And of course, it'll only get that much worse if we drop the standards so that the kids don't even have to learn, the kids and even adults, because we're talking about post-secondary issues too. But when they don't even have to learn the material, and I'll say, by the way, I don't really have a problem with a student who doesn't accept the theory of evolution. I mean, obviously they accept evolution. It's the common ancestry is the thing that they don't accept. But let's say that they just don't buy that explanation. But they took a class where they're required to learn that account, learn that understanding, and they can believe it or not. I mean, this is the goal of science education overall, is to give the exposure to these things. The thing that I'm frustrated by, creationists, and sort of what their goals are, especially in the States, is that they don't want evolution presented. They want to look for these escape hatches like homeschooling, because they don't want their kids, and they'll say, well, we teach both sides. But then you look at the nonsense versions of evolution, and it's completely contrary to the basic principles of education. And when I say this, I'm sort of asking people to reflect on what are some of the things you did learn in school. I remember learning about Nazism in grade 10. It wasn't that the teacher was trying to convince us to be Nazis. It was, there was an underlying philosophy to this. We're going to talk about what the Nazis did, and you're going to, on your exam, you're going to have to answer some questions about what their vision of society was supposed to be. And I could write an exam on Nazism or Christianity, or if I took a course in Islam, I might be able to answer some questions about that. And the creationists should be able to, the kids should be able to give meaningful answers to questions that would reflect an understanding of evolutionary theory, whether they accept it or not. The big problem I have is not that they're not believing it, but that everybody's looking for these escape hatches so that the kids don't have to learn this stuff.
Well, if I can jump in here, I see exactly where you're coming from. I'm not going to be throttling people in my school, getting them up to a wall and say, oh, sorry, bloody advert. I'm not going to throttle people up to my school and say, for F's sake, why do you not believe it? I'm just sort of thinking, gravity is a theory. I mean, you don't see people. It's just, it's like, yeah, you cannot believe it, but it's out there and it's true, and that's more what I'd like to see in the UK. And we are seeing it. It's going to be more rigorously taught, and hopefully you'll get the message across in a much better way, because there's going to be introductions to how the human backbone, vertebrae evolved, and actually using fossils and lessons, which we actually never used, fossils and lessons to use as evidence for evolution. So yeah, I think from what Concord was saying, it's more not just about furthering education, but widening science's outlook and building that pathway to a more logical, rational society.
And by the way, I love that example when people will compare theory of evolution to theory of gravity, because I happen to be one of those people who doesn't believe in gravity. So, I mean, I could if you get. It's true, I don't. It's a construct. It doesn't really exist. Just a theory.
Yeah.
DPR, can we move on to academic freedom? It's a great transition.
Yes. Well, you lead the segue, Concordance.
Okay. So the next topic I wanted to talk about, something I've been reading about on a blog called Why Evolution is True. And it's a story of Eric, and I'm going to pronounce it Heiden, who is a professor, actually a physicist professor at Ball State University. And Eric, in his classroom, his biology classroom, his honors biology class, teaches intelligent design, but also religious apologetics. And Jerry Coyne, who is a fairly prominent biologist and atheist and a variety of other things, has brought this to the attention of Eric's department, Eric Heaton's department, that his content was explicitly religious, was teaching, an unaccepted or non-mainstream view of biology and evolution, and that the students were being taught intelligent design, and this in an honors biology class. The chairman of the department did absolutely nothing, completely ignored it. So enter the Freedom from Religion Foundation again, and has triggered an investigation into whether or not the content of the course is inappropriate or a violation of First Amendment rights. And that's brought up the topic, and there's a great deal of disagreement within the atheist blogging community about whether or not it's appropriate to call someone like Eric Heaton on religious content in a university classroom, whether or not that is covered by academic freedom. And I think maybe we need to talk a little bit about what academic freedom actually is. Well, actually, let me pass the microphone. Hogtie, do you want to talk about academic freedom?
I'll tell you where I want to start is, and it might sort of back us up a little bit, because I just want to kind of copy paste everything that I forgot her name now, Eugenie Scott says about academic freedom in secondary education at the high school level. This very notion that teachers should have academic freedom, like somehow they're independent academics that are there to craft, whatever sort of area of knowledge for their kids. It's just absolutely ludicrous. I just find it such a crazy misapplication of it. The reason I want to start there is because I would make the same point about undergraduate education. That undergraduate education is not the, in my opinion, and I think I'm in good company in this, undergraduate education is not the place to try to craft new knowledge and try to chart a new course for academics. They're just like in high school, but with a little more breadth to it. There is a curriculum. There are learning goals and objectives. And the undergraduate education is really meant to be survey courses that bring people up to a level of competence so that they're ready to approach the threshold of where the information is new and unique. So I find it utterly bizarre that this phrase academic freedom keeps getting borrowed, maybe I should say where it's borrowed from, and misapplied to teaching freedom. Academic freedom is about, when you're a member of the academy, so you're in the professoriate, there is a lot of liberty to sort of venture forward and gain new knowledge. But there are three pillars to what a professor does with his day, essentially. I can say it this way. There is the creation of new knowledge, the communication, dissemination of knowledge to other professionals in the community, and third, the education of the future academics. And academic freedom applies to the first thing, that is this thing about spreading, about creating the new knowledge, venturing out and expanding what humanity understands about the world. The third thing, the teaching and rearing of new academics, is not the domain for, well, you can talk about whatever you want and do whatever you want, because those people need to be cultured into a tradition. You can't just, act like you own your own university and start teaching your undergraduate courses however you want. So with that bit of editorializing, I'll welcome you to throw in.
Well, I'd like to go, I know that Yuri wants to speak. I just initially want to go back to concordance, though, he finished off by saying that it was important to define what academic freedom was, and then didn't. Concordance, what's the difference between academic freedom and freedom of speech?
Well, let's be clear, and this is specifically for academic professors. It has always been, at least in my field, the right to challenge popular theories, the right with research, scholarship, and knowledge to pursue an alternative or an unpopular or even sort of a harebrained theory to the point where you go investigating new knowledge, right? It's always been, to me, very much on the research side. I can do some digging on whether or not Winston Churchill was a transvestite and liked to walk the streets of London at night. No one in the university setting can take that away from me if I can find someone to fund the work. But I can't stand up in a classroom and say that Winston Churchill, who by the way probably was was a transvestite who walked the streets of London at night, unless that is well supported. I don't have the academic freedom to lie to students. And to me, that is very much the challenge here. What we don't want, the big concern, is that knowledge requires a certain level of intellectual autonomy from administration. If we have to get approval from the government or from the university's administration, then that's going to deeply restrict the kind of questions we can ask and the kind of discoveries we can make. So if we're forbidden from doing that, we might never discover Winston Churchill's great secret. But at the same time, the right to teach someone something which you have not verified, something which is not well supported, not being taught. The students have rights as well, in my humble opinion. They have the right to be taught the best and most cutting-edge material. If you have a history professor who is teaching that there was no Holocaust, a Holocaust denialist, or if you have an ecological professor or students of geoscience, and they're being taught that global warming is a big hoax, they don't have that right. I think they're obligated to teach the best material. Now, they can present alternative views, and this is a rare case. Unlike high schools, public high schools, in a private or a university setting, I think it's acceptable to talk about strengths and weaknesses because the students should be at a level where they can evaluate those. In an upper level course, I would have no problem talking about intelligent design from the point of view of strengths and weaknesses. But it's not the right to teach whatever the hell you feel like teaching. It's the right to investigate, to prove, to pursue whatever topic you feel like pursuing.
Yeah, I essentially agree totally with you there. I'm not even at university, but I can safely say, looking at, because I'm a prospective student after all, so I'm looking at courses and so on at universities. And in the UK, I don't know about in the US or Canada, but we have a really good system of, they essentially display lots of statistics at the side of each course. Say it has, it has this student approval, this many students were satisfied, they found this type of work sorry, I have a bit of a list. But yeah, so you could even go beyond what you're defining as academic freedom, and they could talk about these nonsense ideas, in earth science, say global warming is a hoax, or in history, deny the Holocaust. But in the UK, you would be just shot down in an instant, and your course would be in ruins, you would be in ruins, and your university would probably take a hammering in the league tables. So, firstly, it can't really happen in the UK, and secondly, yeah, there's academic freedom where you're free to pursue and teach something if you have the evidence, and if you don't have the evidence, GTFO.
Of course, the counter argument is always the more power we give to the administrators or prevailing views, the less likely we are to have minority opinions brought to light and presented with full enthusiasm, right? If people are having to sneak around and talk about something, that doesn't do the university any good either. So I quite understand both the for and against arguments. I tend to think that the rights of the students outweigh the rights of the professor in this particular case, because what is being taught has been soundly dealt with. If for example, there were a particular viewpoint or a particular question which was still unresolved in biology, and it was something that academic biologists sitting around would say, that's a good question. I don't know how that is done. Then I think presenting that to an upper level class of biology students and giving it to them as a problem to be solved would fall within academic freedom because it would further their education. What I don't think is happening here is I don't think it's in the best interests of the students to be presented with Christian apologetics in an honors biology class. And I know this is also playing into the hands of the intelligent design creationists because it makes it look like, the evil atheists are suppressing and trying to get fired or expelling professors with intelligent design viewpoints. But this really is an issue of protecting students from fraudulent professors, people not truly teaching the material they should be teaching.
Yeah, well, again, I still object to. I'm sorry for interrupting, but I still object to the application of the term academic freedom to what happens in the classroom, especially with undergraduate education or any survey courses, because that is not the freedom granted the members of the academy. It is, and I think we agreed on this. I really like the way you put it. That it's about that acquisition of new knowledge. It's about the research. It's not hiding sort of cloak and dagger when you go to do some research. The thing about So I even object to just the notion that we're going to use the term academic freedom when it comes to choosing the content for what we're going to be teaching undergraduates. That's not to say that the professors or instructors at any level are handcuffed or shackled, because there is still some professional judgment, that you're given a lot of latitude for your judgment. To be a little silly, I'll point out, when I teach introductory statistics, I always teach the non-parametric tests before teaching parametric tests, because in my opinion, that's a better way to do it. Well, you know what? I'm not going to get expelled, and Ben Stein's going to make a movie about how that's crazy that I do that. But no, I just object to it as that whole notion of being academic freedom. One way to look at it is, if you're a professor at a university, those students are not your students, right? You didn't set up that university. They don't pay their tuition to you. They are students of the university. They're students of the deans of the university, and a professor is merely an assistant to the deans of the university in bringing their education forward. You don't have the freedom to decide what you're going to teach them, because they're not your students. They're the school students.
Hear, hear.
If I can jump in, well, basically, I think it's sort of, we can widen this to just in general, the whole basis of far out opinions, which are not necessarily in the consensus. If it harms someone explicitly, like in 9/11 conspiracy theory, which says there was a demolition and it was an excuse for Afghanistan, it may not be true, but it's not explicitly harming one group. If you say it was the Zionist Jews Rothschild conspiracy who are secretly lizards inhabiting a human body, then yeah, that sort of does harm Jewish people. So you got to make sure these far out opinions backed up by evidence and don't harm anyone. And there are always going to be new ideas on the horizon. Like someone in the chat was posting about continental drift, which until the 40s was sort of a strange, weird idea. There was one continent, Pangaea, what the hell? And now we know that's just basic geology. So yeah, we have to be open to new opinions, but we need to make sure backed up by evidence and they don't harm one group or harm, say, that body of students in the class, in the honors class.
Within the scholars, not within the interaction between the students and the scholar.
Wouldn't we all look foolish if in a few years' time creationism was shown to be true? I think we've got a new caller with us. So what have you got for us, Strife?
Well, I mean, interestingly, on the yesterday's show of my show, we actually brought up the Dover trial a little bit earlier. You guys talked about, I noticed, when I just got on to notice the show. Like, it was about censorship and how creationism or intelligent design think the scientific community is censoring them from their peer review papers and stuff. And the thing that's funny, though, is should we prevent it because it's doing harm to people? would you say it does harm?
Can I chip in?
Go ahead.
Yeah, essentially, from my point of view, probably the least experienced and least backed up by evidence point of view on this call, but from my point of view it does, because firstly, evolution is not only a theory of where we are today, it's where we're going. It's how organisms may turn out to be in the next year, 10 years, whatever. And also it's helped us in virology and so on. You can tell how bacterial viruses would evolve. And I think concordance could explain that better. And if you're taking a biology honours class, and in the UK, we have the worst tuition fees, £9,000. If someone was to do that in the UK, I would just leave that university and immediately put in a transfer, because it's not backed up by sufficient evidence. I'm just finished my GCSE biology, and I can already, put a flag down for evolutionary theory. And so, yeah, it will harm the students, particularly if that's a course like biology, which they're dedicating 3 years or 4 to their life to. Yes, it does harm them.
I think I read the question a little bit differently. Does suppressing research on intelligent design cause harm? Maybe I'm misunderstanding, but I just want to point out that there really is no evidence that intelligent design research is being suppressed simply because there basically is no intelligent design research. The whole concept is a bit backwards, misunderstanding how the research would even be structured to detect intelligent design versus existing evolutionary change, because the mechanisms in the present are not in contention. An intelligent design creationist uses the same mechanisms of evolution, current evolution, as a real biologist. And the only thing that differs is the conclusions that they draw from that. The non-continuity, or the things were different in the past kind of theory. But that's not to prevent any intelligent design creationist from starting their own journal, which is exactly what they did. And in the last 4 years that the journal has been in press, I believe they have published 8 articles. 8 articles in 4 years. Almost all of them, I think probably 60-70% of the articles, are by the editors of the journal. So they're peer reviewing themselves.
Is it Belinsky or something? Not Belinsky, it's
Dembski.
Dembski. He's written quite a few for us.
I think Dembski, Behe, didn't Casey Lumpkin
Doug
do one?
Axe and Behe,
Lupsky,
Ann Gauger. Yeah, they started their own journal, which they're free to do. It's technically peer-reviewed because they're reviewing themselves, so that's really peer. They could call it self-review if they wanted to. And there's been no discoveries made. There's been no citations of those papers. They are academic non-entities because they aren't doing any research. I did a breakdown of the Discovery Institute. They're not spending money on research. They're not biologists.
Yet they make money, though. That's the thing that I'm curious about. Like science,
sure.
Science in a sense pays for itself, with discoveries and stuff. In creationism or intelligent design, the people give them money to do supposed research while they just keep making money.
Yeah, they make money by donations from religious fundamentalist groups. And again, this is another thing I broke down. The Koch brothers are their single largest, this is the group behind the Tea Party, single largest contributor to the Discovery Institute. If you look at the funding, it's not the funding one gets for a private research organization. It's a legal front. That's all it is. It's all it's ever been. And they wanted to have some peer-reviewed papers, so they made up a journal. And yeah, technically it's peer-reviewed. And they put out a couple of articles that were just showpieces that didn't stand up to scrutiny. And they reviewed themselves so they could be sure that they were published. Why did it take them so long to figure out that trick? I don't know. They're not very bright.
I mean, I've actually, ironically, I've found a book a while ago called Scientists Confront Creationism, and it's from the 80s. And the interesting thing is it talks about the same thing as the intelligent design movement, except it talks about scientific creationism. It mentions the formation of creationism from the populist movement of the anti-intellectuals and stuff, and it mentions the same tactics that Morris did, which is pretty similar to the intelligent design community, which which I would say is the same thing. I would go as far.
Oh, it's hilarious. You know, they claim intelligent design, and I'm speaking here of the Discovery Institute's blog, Evolution News and Views, which is hilarious.
Oh yeah, I've been there. It's laughable. It's laughable.
They have a definition of evolution that includes 4 consequences of evolutionary theory that have nothing to do with evolutionary theory. It reads like this run-on between Answers in Genesis and, you know, the religious Dover, the Dover trial, the religious side on the Dover trial's arguments. And you've got your Casey Luskin plus your Ken Ham, and somewhere in between those two, you get the Discovery Institute party line.
I mean, my question is like you say the Koch brothers are the ones funding them. Imagine what good that research money would do in the right hands. You know, they get like hundreds of millions, I think.
Oh, I don't think they got that much. I think like 20 million. I'll have to look it up.
And if I remember correctly, they also had this weird program. This is like old, I remember. They had some kind of program where they would pay college students to work for them.
Yeah, they also have a summer program. They do
$10,000, I think it was.
Programs.
They give $10,000 or something.
Yep. They have summer programs where you can go out to Seattle and spend the summer at the Discovery Institute working with them. And yeah, it's a paid internship kind of thing.
My question would be, what exactly do you do? Like, I mean, like do you like get to meet Dembski? Is that like the whole thing? Like, what do you do?
I think a lot of them probably have an intention to go into public policy, First Amendment law, and they want to be part of that whole debate, work on political, it's a very politically connected group. If you think creationism isn't a major issue in politics, try asking presidential candidates how they stand on evolution. And
McCain said yes, and they said no.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, I think everyone actually eventually said that they didn't believe in evolution, which is lovely.
So, Strife, I'm going to be moving on to a new topic, but thank you very much indeed for the call. We'll catch up with you soon. The topic that was one of the news items recently in the last week in this country was the fact that there was an outcry that we were all subject to surveillance, and that our secret services were getting information from, in particular, America about which websites we visit and the like, and checking our emails. I know it's a somewhat shift of topic, but I found it somewhat surprising that so many people in this country were outraged by the idea that someone may be tracking which websites they visit. And I just wanted to throw this one out to the panel and also anyone that may be watching. Do you have an issue with it? And I'll put my cards on the table. I do not care one jot if my secret services are investigating which websites I visit or even reading my emails, let alone seeing who I'm sending them to. And I'm quite genuine about that. No problem at all. I think they'd be utterly bored if they visited the sites or read my emails. I could understand it would be different if you had a government or a secret service that you didn't have any confidence or trust in. But is there anyone here that thinks that this is an issue and has a problem with their government secret service tracking their internet activity? Should we start with you, Hogtie?
Yeah, I have a problem with it. I'm not really sure how to phrase it because I respect that. I think a large part of my problem is a cultural bias. The province I'm from is definitely more right wing than others. I think that the closest you're going to find in a Canadian to being an American is someone from Alberta, and I just the whole idea that the government would monitor. I'm uncomfortable with it. And I don't know how to really put it into words. I do know that one of my concerns is that when your private information gets copied around, there's increased opportunity for screw-ups and malfeasance. Our Secret Service, by the way, famous for being a little Clouseau-esque and doing things like having a bunch of confidential documents that were left in a briefcase outside a Tim Hortons donut shop, ended up getting stolen. I mean, just silly things like that. I don't know. I mean, I think when I think about this issue, one thing that kind of dances across my mind is that what form does the surveillance take? Like, are we moving more to a more automated? Because if we think about what does it mean to try to monitor everybody's websites and their emails? I mean, the volume of data would just be incredible. Are we talking about having some computer system that would algorithmically go through and search for keywords and patterns and interconnections? You know, this person sent email to this person who has regular contact with those people, so they get a bump in their score. I have less of a problem with that sort of traffic monitoring than I do with, well, like in the States, that situation with their one of their services monitoring phone sex calls between military people deployed and their wives back home. I mean, that I'm really uncomfortable with. So I don't know.
Again, it kind of matters more to me what they do with the data. One thing that came up, and I can't remember where I read this, that basically the decision was quite a while back, 2006 or before, that you don't have a reasonable expectation of privacy when you're on your cell phone. That was agreed at the court level, that when you're talking on a cell phone, that's not a private conversation. You're broadcasting information through the air, more or less unencrypted, or barely encrypted, to the point where it would be quite simple to decrypt that. And someone with the right equipment, which is not illegal equipment, could reasonably intercept that communication. I guess I'm with DPR. I know I should be worried about it, but I can't see how it actually will affect me. And maybe I just need someone to explain it to me, why I should be more up in arms about the fact that my government monitors. Geez, I'm boring, but I got to think there are so many people out there and so much content being generated every day that there's just no way for them to spend their time finding out that, you know, I buy stupid stuff on Amazon, or I look at pictures of naked women. What do they do with that? How would that possibly come back on me?
I think Hogtie's right in his analysis of what they effectively do. The amount of data that is flying around the ether is far too great for them to monitor. What they do is look for patterns, sometimes keywords, and obviously if they have suspicions about a particular person, any communications with those are going to get a red light flashing somewhere, I guess. But even with then, I suspect somewhat ineffective and a monumental task. But if it does prevent, for example, terrorist attacks, or leads to information gathering about terrorists, then I have absolutely no problem with the argument, oh, well, you know, these people's human rights have been infringed or something like that. It just seems to me to be a nonsense. But I suspect, as I say, it does rely in you having a certain degree of confidence and trust in those gathering the information.
I was about to ask, do you trust your government? Maybe that's why. And yeah. I'm going to say I'm equally as boring as Concordance on what I do on the internet. And I find that as the one person who's spoken up so far to say, well, I have a problem with it, with the government looking into these things, I can't really offer much justification for that. You know, Concordance says, well, he would need somebody to explain why we should be up in arms about it. I hope you're amused by my position on this, that I do feel up in arms about it. But I think I still need someone to call in and explain why I should be up in arms about it.
Well, pause there. There's an invitation to anyone that may be watching on Ustream, on Vaughan, or on the Magic Sandwich Show. Send a Skype contact request to Magic Sandwich Show. Or even, if you like, it's just send me a PM on the live stream on the website. I'll read out your questions. But I'd be very curious to know what people's issues are. Sorry,
please explain why TheHogTieChamp is up in arms redneck about it. No, I just wanted to make the point really quickly about the trust, and maybe that's why I'm not so upset about it. Is that I do generally trust the Canadian government's except for their clumsiness, the silly things that happen. But they're certainly well-intentioned people, and I think overall we've kept ourselves out of some pretty big jams because, you know what, somebody has to be in charge. This is the thing too. I think where I have more concern about the amount of data that's collected and analyzed with how I use my cell phone, what I do on the web, where I use my bank card, is all the corporations that collect this data and store it and do things with it. I hate when I see targeted advertising. I heard this expression a few years ago in response to George Orwell's 1984. Somebody had said, well, in the modern world, you know, having heard the warning of George Orwell, in the modern world, we shouldn't be that concerned about Big Brother, but rather all the little brothers that monitor what you do. And I'm more upset about all the private corporations that I don't get to vote in and out of power, that know what websites I look at and know where I use my bank card and things like that.
Grey Wolf says, let's say you were protesting about something and they wanted to silence you, they could use that information to do that. I think that goes back to the issue of trust in the government, doesn't it?
You know, they couldn't do that without sort of devaluing the surveillance, because everyone's a friggin' whistleblower. You have to be very careful how you use something like that as a, you know, I remember when the same thing happened, when they started having red light cameras all across the U.S. I know in London is supposed to be completely canvassed now by cameras. There is no expectation of privacy in any public place, anywhere along any street, or at any intersection in the United States where there's a red light camera. They could monitor you, but who the hell has time to monitor everyone in the world all the time? I have to see what the effect is. What are they doing with the data before I can get really upset? I would rather they didn't. I'd rather know that I actually have privacy somewhere sometime. But they could be watching you from space right now, and of course
I'll give you an
space lizards.
Yeah, I'll give an example. Recently there was a case, I'm talking only a couple of weeks ago, and a young lady had been abducted in the middle of England. And the car had been traced to a city in Scotland. And as a result of that, someone was arrested within a very short time. And they had done that by using CTV footage from motorway service stations and the like. And they managed to piece this together, the route that had been taken. Obviously, with a registration number, it made it fairly easy to find out who the person they wanted to talk to was. But if I had travelled that route in a perfectly innocent way, why would I have a problem with that same footage being recorded covering my car and my journey? I've got no problem. When you can show so clearly that it can, if not prevent crimes, it can certainly help detect them. I'm with you. I have to struggle. But I know Yuri wants to make a point. Once you've done that, Yuri, I'm going to take a next caller. Yuri.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on for so long. My point is, just basically the same as DPI and concordance, and more or less to the same extent as TheHogTieChamp. I don't really care. I mean, Google Incognito, once you open it, the first thing it says, it can't stop spies. But yeah, who really cares? I mean, they're not exactly going to kill you or give you a fine for watching porn or buying weird stuff on Amazon and so on. And if we raise the question, do you trust your government? I could be here for hours. But domestically, I think the British government is pretty lenient. I mean, when we had the McCarthy era, all the sort of militant leftists came over here and, you know, as long as it didn't cause trouble, it was fine. So I think Britain's always been fairly tolerant of people. And when it does get out of hand, I mean, you know, Islamic extremists and so on can clamp down in a pretty civil way. And yeah, like that example of the girl who went missing, that was quite shocking because I actually went to like a sort of youth culture conference, and in the Facebook group of this sort of conference, it was like she actually went there, and that apparently helped sort of investigators. But yeah, as long as you've got nothing to hide, as William Hague said, nothing to hide, and you're not up to any sort of fiendish motives, you're fine. And those people who say, oh, it's against human rights, civil liberties, and find them closet revolutionaries or people who'd like to do something bad in the future, leaving the possibility to open it. That's what I think. So, yeah, as long as you've got nothing to hide, you're fine.
Can I toss in one point real quick?
Yeah, sure. But I'm just going to remove Yuri because we've got Bud joining us. I can't find him to remove him. But thank you very much indeed for the call, Yuri.
Oh, okay, thanks for having me on. Bye.
Take care.
That was actually a really good topic, and I wish I'm changing my mind now. Now I don't have a problem with it. You guys have convinced me. But here's the thing. This is why I don't have a problem with it now, and I do trust the government because, as the expression goes, who is watching the watchers? The most surveilled group of people we have in Canada is the Canadian government. Whenever somebody makes a Freedom of Information request, there's actually a federal website where every FOIP request goes up there and the governmental response to it. So if you write in, you want to find out about whether some inspector for hot dogs did something, you can send in a request. They put the request up on, and they put the answer for everybody in the country to look at. So, I mean, if there was something weird going on with the government data, these watchdog groups just write in these letters and it all goes up on a website. I mean, the Canadian government doesn't get away with much. And maybe that's a model for the rest of the world to look at is, you know what, if the government wants to shine a bright light under our skirts, then they better be willing to disclose, have daylight on everything they do too.
I'm not reassured by the goodwill of my government. The U.S. government has my best interest at heart. Ha ha ha. They don't. They don't give a damn about me. I have no illusions that my government is a good government. What I am reassured by is the massiveness of the task and their general incompetence. I feel like my best shield is the fact that there's no way they could be watching me enough in any way that truly intrudes on my privacy. But again, I wonder if I'm missing something here on the chilling effect. I guess I never assumed that I had any privacy. Maybe that's what it is I've sort of grown up under the assumption that they're always watching and that if they wanted to, they could get me at any time. So I don't live under any kind of illusions of what rights I truly have. They seem to violate them as often as they feel like, and they're incompetent enough that they have a hard enough time bothering the actual criminals, keeping up with the criminals. I don't think they have time to keep up with the law-abiding citizens.
Well, hopefully we've got a new caller who might take a different issue because we've got three people in agreement. Bored to bits. Are you going to take up a contrary view?
I am slightly.
Good.
On a couple of issues. The first is that you have no idea what profile they're looking for at any time. The question of the amount of data and chewing through it isn't an issue. Just start typing into Google and it knows what you want to type and how you want to type it. Search engines are chewing through binary data. It's not hard for them to find data. I think of the issue of like CND and Greenpeace. Those people who joined those groups were profiled as troublemakers, and they were then watched by the security services. The problem is we don't have oversight of security services because security services are as secretive as they can, and they'll get away with what they can. They'll push the boundaries all the time. Probably a more important issue, which is very prevalent, very current in the UK, is that money talks. And the people working at these places will abuse their powers to extract information and sell it. And I can think of, one simple example is, you say in Gordon's, you think you're totally open and everything else. The problem is you may find out later in life that you're paying more for your insurance than perhaps you ought to be. And the reason you're paying more for your insurance is simply because of websites that you visit that some insurance company somewhere has got an inside person who they just, every time somebody applies for insurance, they just whiz off an email to this guy, what websites, and they then profile you based on your websites. And it's arbitrary, but it's a method they use. And these are the sort of abuses that can occur.
What possible reason is there to prevent an insurance company from using purely arbitrary means to offer a private contract with someone? They can use whatever criteria they want, can't they? It's a matter of private contract law.
Well, yes, but the point is that they're not allowed to go to, let's say in this country, GCHQ and ask for information on people. But we know that there's people within GCHQ, because they're just human beings, and they will sell information. I mean, the police abuse their number plate recognition. Anyone who knows police knows that they've used the databases for their own personal benefit. And that is the problem, because say you don't know. I mean, at the moment everything's fine, and we live in a fairly, as long as you're not a Muslim, you're fairly safe in our two countries, or far right in this country at the moment. But you don't know how it's going to change. I mean, the US. Think of McCarthyism. Think what McCarthyism would have been like today, with access to what everybody's viewing and what everybody's typing on the internet. There is the third side to it, which I think is that children should be taught all this at school, because all these youngsters who are on the internet flashing their bits at their boyfriends and girlfriends, they don't realise that within a couple of years, probably within 5 years, when they apply for a job, their prospective employer is just going to plug their image into YouTube and have their entire internet history available, thanks to Google.
Well, that would. There are two things there. Just dealing with that last point. I mean, if you post things onto Facebook and your employer happens to see it, and we often hear of this sort of story where someone's posted onto Facebook, "Hey, I'm pulling a sickie today, can't be bothered going into work," and they arrive at work the next day and are told that they've been dismissed. They're curious as to why that would be. That's because of information they have published themselves. So obviously, let's make that distinction. And secondly, I would agree with you in this regard. We don't know exactly what's happening with the information and to what degree it is being abused. But in the same way as surveillance organizations are concerned, the same must apply for any organization. For people to get any meaningful information about you, I suspect that you're going to have to be targeted in some way. Now, I know with the speed of computers and the modern algorithms that there are, putting certain keywords in and seeing what comes up is probably not a particularly complex task, but I suppose I'm struggling to think, and again I'm just reducing it to my own personal circumstances, I'm struggling to think how any information that I could post could have any impact on my everyday life.
Well, it might not be information you post. I mean, as I say, you'd have to sit down and think about this for a while, but it may be a simple case that there are websites which go in and out of the profiling within the security services. And if you happen to access the website while that website's being profiled, then your name goes on a list. And I say, you might think, well, I haven't got any problem with any of the websites I go to. But there may be an issue later on, again, thinking of the CND and Greenpeace thing, where you fall into a profile bucket, which, it's not fair, but you've fallen into it simply because you've gone to a couple of websites where all the people who access that website, all their IP addresses have been stored away somewhere, and much later on, 5 years down the line, somebody requests that data, pulls it out, and you're the wrong side of the line.
HogTie, you were persuaded by concordance and I that you shouldn't have any worries. Have you now been persuaded to the opposite way again?
No, I still, I don't know. I just have this uncomfortable feeling with it again, but it certainly seems, worth it. I'm sort of taking your point that there's such obvious demonstrable good that comes from this sort of surveillance that it's kind of hard to dig in your heels and say, I wish it weren't the case. I think I take Bod's point though that it's very easy to kind of be misrepresented. Like when you show up as being flagged for something, You went to a website. I've gone to questionable websites. I'm just so curious about stuff when a discussion's going on. I say, well, I want to go check that out. And you go check it out, and then you think, oh, well, geez, I hope my IP address doesn't go into some sort of a registry. I think ultimately, though, there are guarantees that bad things don't happen to you just on the basis of some sort of profiling, right? You're out driving your car late at night. You're not going to get thrown in jail for looking like you stole a car. And I'm kind of hoping, again, it just all comes down to faith in the government, right? If you trust that your government isn't sweeping up these IP addresses I don't know. I guess I also have to say I sort of take exception with the idea that insurance companies would somehow abuse it. I'm not sure how insurance works in other countries, but the premiums are very regulated in Canada. At least they can't go based on your web browsing history to set your premium. So no, I think it takes me right back to where it started. I think I would rather that there wasn't a need for there to be any sort of overseers like that. But I can't see how it messes up my life.
Now, I think B2B has good points and things I hadn't really thought about. The whole genetic testing thing was very big when I was going to school, and I was genetics major, among other things. But we debated this idea of medical ethics. Should your medical records be above reproach? Should you have absolute privacy in that regard? And of course, everyone agreed we should, and that's why we have a lot of the HIPAA laws we have now. That being said, a lot of this information that B2B is talking about is information which we freely broadcast en masse to the world. You're standing outside on the street shouting, my name is this and my social security number is this, and I like feathers in my nether regions. Those are the kinds of things that it's not as though they've come into your private space. I don't think. I don't consider when I'm, going to the Greenpeace website, or if I'm, curious about Stormfront or the Nazi movement in America, I don't consider that my going to a public website is a private act that's somehow protected. And that's how I comport myself on the web. And I'm sure people make mistakes about that and probably regret them later. But it's no different than if I signed my name to, the Communist Party of America's manifesto. I would assume that was intended for public consumption. If I put a photograph of myself up on the web, I assume people will find it, even people who I don't necessarily want to find it, and I behave accordingly. And maybe that's where I'm a little detached, is I have never had that expectation that the things I do on the web are somehow magically protected from prying eyes, whether those eyes are government or insurance. Now, intruding on my cell phone conversation seems a little bit more across that gray area and across the line, because I do generally consider that conversation to be private. But I've never seen it used. So I guess my expectation is just based on experience. I've seen plenty of cases where the Wayback Machine pulls up my old websites, or I found some website I worked on years ago was archived somewhere, but I've never heard my phone conversations referenced in government documents. So again, just basing on my own personal experience, I find very different expectations of privacy.
I don't think the issue is really one of, I don't know, Board, help me if I'm misunderstanding this. It's not so much that you have a fear of surveillance. It goes back to the issue of trust. And I was just thinking, before websites, and I'm sure that everyone else in this conversation is far too young to remember these days, but there used to be what they called public libraries, which were buildings that were full of books. And if you wanted to, you could go and take a ticket, which you could only get through giving certain identification, and you could take a book out, and it would be recorded which book you'd taken out. What's the difference with someone keeping a register of what websites you have visited? It's just a matter of, I think, or tell me if I'm wrong, it's a matter of what you think, how you think that information and the ease to which that information can be used that is a problem. Yeah.
Well, the difference is, DPL, is at the end of the day, when you'd finished with your book, they literally wiped the slate clean and started chalking it new the next day. But no, I take your point, and I agree. I think that I say my issue is with this profiling thing, where they, yeah, everything you do is open, and anyone who's on the internet should understand that. But if they start scoring people based on their activity, I mean, like Concordance says, you go and visit this website because you want to look at, read about the Nazis and all the rest of it. But and if you're really into that research, then you visit enough of these sites and you end up with a score that puts you into the profiling bin, and then you have people, and then you're under surveillance. And then they are listening into your phone record, your phone conversations, because you've fallen the wrong side of the profile. And I agree that, if you're innocent, you've got nothing to worry about, but you don't know the parameters under which they're working, and how much confidence do you have in the government, the representative oversight of these security organizations.
I actually, I was so shocked when I heard this news report that everyone was outraged that, governments, particularly the US government, could be handing over information to our secret services because of what happened. Not the next news item, it was the one following. I actually got up and made a note of it. And unfortunately, I haven't got that note to hand. But unless I can find it very quickly, I will do my best to recollect it. First news item, shock, outrage. Private information about us and websites we visit is being handed over by the likes of American Secret Service to our Secret Service. Second news item, not of consequence. Third news item, outrage that only 1 in 15 people who are visiting paedophile websites are actually being convicted. I just couldn't believe it. On the one hand, they're complaining about surveillance of websites, and the third news item, they're complaining of the inefficiency of certain websites being scrutinized. I mean,
But that probably supports Concordance that there is too much data for them to go with, and I'd imagine the security services on both sides of the Atlantic are concentrating on terrorism rather than sex crimes, or at least they're apportioning the staff that way, or they simply don't have enough resources to do the job. So in a way, that actually supports Concordance's idea that there's just too much data for them to mine through anyway.
Hooray for me.
Yeah, Concordance, you're always correct in the end. I can't believe you also claim, on the one hand, to have a really boring life and then talk about feathers and genitalia. I don't know quite what websites you're visiting, Concordance.
Well, it was that time you showed me. Remember?
I know that, moving quickly on, I know that I think Hogtie had a couple of issues that he wanted to talk about. I know we're coming towards the end of the show. Hogtie, I apologise. Yeah, a couple of topics you had suggested for discussion. Do stay with us, Board, as we move on to those very quickly.
I'm trying to remember what I know. I had already raised one of them. I did want to say first that you're a gentleman. I do appreciate you sending to me by courier my 2 bottles of water. That was very honorable of you. I think the one thing I'd mentioned to you in Skype was what was it? The Good News Club. But I had mentioned that before. I think we sort of covered a lot of ground with that topic when we were discussing the thing about the leaving the Bibles out and whatnot, and I sort of touched on the issue of the Good News Club, which I consider to be a lot more heinous because it is a very active sort of proselytizing and in a very sort of a destructive way. I don't know if we could really sort of energize a discussion on that whole topic right now, but I certainly would want to take the opportunity to tell anyone who's listening, if this is the first time you've heard of the Good News Club, get on Google, get on YouTube, and search for it, because I mean, first off, it's one of those great sort of ironic ways that some radical Christians will just use a word to mean the exact opposite of what it really is. This is not good news at all. They really teach kids that they're bound for hell if they don't believe a certain way. And, well, thank goodness you believe that way, but those other kids that you hang out with don't believe that way, so they're going to hell, and you should probably stay away from those kids. It's really destructive and decisive. I think the one thing that had come up from Good News Club that was sort of relevant to what we were talking about before with these Bibles that we unfortunately had kind of skipped over was that they actually had put forward a lawsuit saying that the schools couldn't keep them out for the reason we were discussing, that the school can't say, well, the volleyball club can come in and the fishing club can come in, but oh, you're religious, so we have to keep you out. That actually would be inconsistent with the spirit of separation of church and state. However, I think that schools, I know if I were a principal of a school, there's no way Good News Club would be getting into my school, because the schools have every right to, like a good secular motivation here, keep out any groups that bring demonstrable harm to the kids there. And the Good News Club, I think it's a very good, strong secular case could be made for showing that they're a very, very harmful organization to have running around your elementary school. And I hope that communities in the States can kind of work from those grounds and say, we just don't need them. Not because it's, Christianity or not Christianity or this form of Christianity or whatever else, but because they are genuinely harmful. So I encourage people to look for any of those videos, documentaries on these guys. And anybody else on the panel as pissed off about Good News Club as I am?
Never heard of it.
What?
Never heard of it.
Oh, well, it's certainly a bigger issue in the States than anywhere else, but they're particularly weaselly.
Well, it's something to look
I mean,
out
the
for. And
problem
I want to go back to Bored to Bits for a second, because I was just thinking about how information is used as a result of visiting certain websites. And what I have found, and I have no explanation as to why this would be, but clearly as a result of going to various websites, I find that in my email inbox, normally in the junk email, I get a lot of emails from pharmacists who are offering me assistance in my erectile dysfunction problem, and also websites that are, or organizations that are offering me assistance in improving the size of my manhood. And I honestly don't know which websites I visited that has meant that someone's thought it necessary to send me this information. But who else gets stuff in their email box that they think, hang on, why am I getting this?
I often wonder what my wife has been posting on her Facebook page that informs all these companies that I need all this significant help with my genitals. Very strange.
Yeah, whenever I subscribe to a site, I always subscribe to it through an old Hotmail account, and so everything just gets dumped into the trash there, and I never see it.
My mom does. That's a great trick, is to actually have like a junk collecting. This will be my public little sort of junk collecting. My mom doesn't know that trick, and one of my favorite email messages she'd ever sent to me, she'd forwarded me a message that she'd received, and honest to God, this is what it said. It said, "Charlotte, enlarge your penis now."
She might have one in a jar.
Your boring concordance. That is sick. I suppose we can't let it go, can we, Hogtie? Your reference to 2 bottles of water. Because we did start 10, 15 minutes late, let's just finish off with what you're referring to there, which is Jason Burns, who I'm sure a lot of our viewers will be familiar with, has been boasting that he'll be publishing a world-class academic paper, and has done since about the beginning of March, I think. And whilst it took about 90 days beyond when it should have been posted, he's actually posted the first part, which has not met with great approval. And as a result, I messaged him and invited him onto the show. But he was somewhat insistent. The only reason he would, his terms for coming on the show included sending him 2 bottles of mineral water. HogTie, I think it's unfair to be too critical of him because he's not here to defend himself, but it's an odd case, I think, of again one of these situations where you're dealing with a Christian that.
Well, I mean, certainly you have to say he's engaged. I think having read what is sort of an introduction, it's clear that he's put a lot of work into it, and he's definitely engaged in the topic. I don't even know that it's fair to say that his paper, what he's got up there so far hasn't been well received, but I think only because of the great amount of self-fanfare, the sort of, posting an introduction, which I thought was kind of a good start. It was a promise of things to come, right? What I saw of the introduction was he's saying that the resurrection of Christ is a central pillar to Christian theology. And I think most of us would agree that it is very important. I don't think there's really a lot of room to sort of debate around that. But then the further writing is going to sort of make the case for the reality of the resurrection. I think where the mockery comes in is the suggestion that, well, now the case has been made just because, there's a few paragraphs up there. I think that's kind of where the mockery started. I do know he's put a lot of work into it, so we might see more stuff come out. I'll tell you the thing that I take away from the introduction so far and from the sort of early declaration of victory is I find this puzzling at times. This is consistent with presuppositional apologetics. This idea that, I guess, what they think passes for proof, right? Like, I think what it is a lot of these guys have trouble understanding why the other parties don't understand something. I guess let me put it this way, is if I had to explain to somebody the whole thing about the speed of light being constant in whatever reference frame you're in, and you know how those videos, whenever you see someone explain it, they say, well, if you were in a train car and you fired a bullet and it was a glass train, so somebody outside the train could see the bullet go, then they would see the bullet moving at a different speed than would be perceived by the person in the train. Okay, you get that right. Well, light doesn't work that way. And then they go on to explain it that way. The reason I mention that is because when people go to explain this peculiar thing about the speed of light, they recognize that it's peculiar, they recognize that it's counterintuitive, and they start by trying to identify why you, the listener, might have trouble understanding it. Where it seems like these Christians that are especially presuppositionalists, they go no distance to try to understand why somebody doesn't already buy in to what they're selling. And in fact, when they try to kind of put themselves in the other person's shoes and say, well, why don't you believe in Christ? Oh, forget it. I already know the reason. It's because you hate God and because you love your sin and blah, blah, blah. And they'll insert your own reason why you don't believe their argument. And then you kind of go, oh, okay, well, whatever. And it's sort of the whole argument kind of fizzles out there. That was kind of my take on the introduction.
I'll tell you what my take was on the introduction was, and it was this. And I messaged him privately, as I always do, because I don't want to bring unnecessary publicity to him. But my point was, Jason, your introduction could be reduced to 3 sentences. Sentence 1, the resurrection is at the center of Christian belief. Sentence 2, in the future parts of this paper, I will show that there is evidence for the resurrection. Sentence 3, atheists cannot deal with this evidence and therefore cannot disprove Christianity. But he spent pages of multicolored, different type-fonted stuff, including multimedia links and unreliably referenced material to make those points. And then, having done so, and this is what really irritated me, said that he'd won the argument. And when he was challenged on this, he said, well, no, obviously the introduction isn't the argument, but he'd already boasted that he'd won us. The Magic Sandwich Show, me, Aaron, Concordance, Thunderfoot, Matt Dillahunty, and everyone. He'd won us all just by posting this introduction. I know exactly where he's going with the argument because he sort of hinted upon it, but not in his actual introduction. He's going to question what it is for something to be a fact. How do you study history? And he's going to use whatever means he can to justify a literal interpretation of the Bible. It's quite obvious that's where he's going, and I don't think it's going to be particularly novel. It's not going to be interesting, but let's wait till we get it, Jason. Don't claim victory after posting a pithy introduction.
And I do think that was Aaron's point on the League of Reason forums, was he said, you know what, I'm not going to declare victory. The guy says he's going to put his paper up. Well, let's wait and see what he says. And I do think that was kind of the reasonable approach to go with it. I will also say I think your 3-point summary was pretty much captured what was in the introduction, and it was sort of the starting place, not really fanfare worthy. I think in the introduction, Jason kind of derails himself with the fight itself. Rather than making his own argument, he kind of derails himself with the fight with Aaron Ra, and he does something that I think, if it were an academic that did this, I would call this academic dishonesty. In this context, I might call it accidental academic dishonesty. And that is playing that little clip of Aaron's sort of self-biographical interview where he was saying, oh, I used to believe in astral projection, and I used to believe in this, I used to believe in aliens, I used to believe in that, but now my life has changed, I don't believe those things. And then to follow that little clip up by saying, well, do you notice what he doesn't do? He doesn't disprove that the resurrection happened. And he's go, what? I mean, he could have taken a video clip of Aaron or Richard Dawkins or somebody talking about a camping trip they went on one time and then said, there, you see, that's his best argument, and he didn't disprove Christianity. Well, that wasn't the purpose of that clip. So he is kind of prone to derailing his argument, which was unfortunate there.
Jason has uploaded 4 videos about this show whilst this show has been on. So that's why I avoid Jason.
Let's not finish on a gloomy note like that, though, because there was someone sent me a message or posted in the chat, I can't remember, but it goes back to the comment that you made very much earlier on in the show, Hogtie, and I want to deal very briefly with this because I think it's actually an interesting point. It's the one where you said that you don't believe in the theory of gravity. And some people took you seriously, some didn't. I'm not sure. If you were to be critical of it, then in a kind of way I would understand. If your criticism was that it doesn't really explain how it all works, I would accept it. But if your criticism was that it didn't give a very good predictive model of gravity, then I would have concerns. Were you taking the piss, or were you being somewhat serious?
It's half and half. There's a bit of piss taking in there. I raise the issue when I say this, and no, I do not believe in gravity. I'll have to explain that, of course, but it's because when I say that, I want people to question and think about what we say when we say that we don't believe a theory. Obviously, gravity as a theoretical account, as a descriptive set of laws that help us understand and predict what's going to happen if I take one of my free water bottles and drop it. We can come to understand what it's going to do. Now, if this were out in space and I had 2 water bottles that were a light year apart, theory of gravity in its early form isn't going to help much because it'll say that they'll start accelerating towards each other. Of course, they won't. If they're a light year apart, they won't start accelerating towards each other for a full year. They'll sit idle, then they'll start moving. So there has to be sort of a modification to the theory of gravity. But when I say I don't believe in gravity, what I'm saying is that people believe that when I hold this bottle like this, that there is a force, that this bottle is attracted to the earth. And this bottle is not attracted to the earth, nor is the earth attracted to the bottle. I don't believe that matter is attracted to other matter in the conventional way that we talk about gravity. And I believe that the theory of gravity gives us a good way to predict what the bottle is going to do when I let it go. But I don't believe that there's some sort of magnetic force that pulls the 2 masses together.
Is it angels pushing it down?
It's the angels pushing down. That's right. It's intelligent falling, intelligent pushing.
No, sorry. Do carry on. But what do you mean?
What I do mean is that the Earth, that this bottle is traveling in a straight line through its vision of space-time, and the Earth causes a distortion in space-time, and this bottle will continue in a straight line through space-time, but it progresses through bent space-time, and that's why it takes the evidently curved path of parabolically falling.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Thank goodness.
There is no force of gravity.
Easy one.
There's no gravitons. There is simply space-time is warped by massive bodies, but the theory of gravity is the best way to express how we interact with space-time.
If there are no gravitons, how does a tractor beam work on Star Trek? Boom!
On that bombshell, can I thank everyone that's been watching? We will see you hopefully in 2 weeks' time. Take care.